Hey guys, how are all of you beautiful people? Hope all of you are doing great. This is next part of What If Naruto Repeat Chunin Exam, where Naruto finds he is flung back in time and must repeat the entire Chunin exam over and over and over, until he gets it right and possibly saves Konoha in the bargain. So let's start without any delay. Orochimaru didn't want to believe it, but there he was, his two subordinates standing quietly behind him as the Chunin took in the details of a complete and accurate down to the scratches copy of his own private office in sound. And there, decorating the walls and desk, were maps and papers detailing his invasion plans for Konoha, just as he'd arranged them back in his village. Konoha was mocking him. Here they had his entire invasion plan, including those parts he had not bothered to tell his allies, pinned up where he could not help but notice them in a scale model of his own village. There was even a cup of his own favorite tea sitting on the desk where he frequently left it, and it was still warm. That looked like a copy of his favorite cup, too. The whole office was like that. The snake Chunin could tell this was not his own. Thousands of subtle differences that any ninja could detect, from the pattern of the wood grain to slight smells, to the feel of the atmosphere as the air tended to be heavier and muggier in rice country than in fire. But this wasn't intended to fool. It was a warning that they knew everything, not only about the invasion plans and his base of operations, but of the tea he liked to drink. Idly, Orochimaru picked up the cup and sampled it, not afraid of any poisons. It was just the way he liked it, prepared not minutes ago. Holding this replacement cup, letting it warm his hands, the wondering Chunin took in the astonishing level of details present in this convincing fake. They had even gone to the extent of detailing his private office down to the carpet stains from a subordinate he'd killed last month, a place he'd scratched the desk with a pen, and the scuff marks on one wall where he liked to slither up a concealed chimney. Orochimaru checked. His supposedly secret escape chimney was there. He did not bother to check where it would go. They knew he had it. That was enough, along with the rest of this detail, to fully convince him they knew where it went, even if that little detail wasn't included in this copy office. It was also enough to fully convince him that Konoha had somehow been spying on him to a degree that he'd thought impossible, not only for the depth, accuracy and thoroughness of the spying itself, but he'd always been under the impression that Konoha had no spy net worth the name. Obviously, he'd been mistaken. The worst sort of spies were those the enemy does not know you have. He had taken advantage of this himself against Konoha, or so he'd thought. But for them to have this level of detail on him when he'd had no clue they even had a spy network worth the name. Well, now he knew who had been winning those espionage contests, and it had not been him. He reached under his desk, triggering a secret catch that on his own desk back in sound released a poisoned kunai into his grasp. To his astonishment, the catch was there, it did work the correct way and a kunai got released into his grasp. Although, instead of the rare poison from grass, one that had no known antidote, and was quite rare and expensive due to the number of people who died trying to gather it, this one was smeared in maple syrup. Still, it was the thought that counted. They knew it was there, how the catch worked, and the fact they did not release to him a kunai coated with a rare and terrible poison could almost be seen as mockery, that he was a joke. It would not have been coated in anything had they not known the original was poisoned. They simply chose not to arm him with a deadly weapon. Basic ninja tools were insignificant to a ninja of his caliber. The kunai meant nothing without that dreadful poison. Having a victim dying in agony over a period of hours due to an incurable toxin was entertaining in ways simply stabbing them with a kunai was not. Frankly, Killing someone with a kunai was more effort than slaying them with the use of some of his impressive store of ninja techniques. The lack of poison was simply an insult, just like the dancing hippo behind his desk had been. It wasn't like they couldn't have done it accurately, they knew what he looked like and could have left a disguised clone there. They simply chose not to. At least they could have made his replacement an alligator. Contemplating this, Orochimaru was unprepared for when the entire mock-up of his village exploded, having been built on a foundation of exploding tags. As he staggered, injured, out of the crater that had once been a copy of his supposedly secret main base, both his companions dead from the blast, the onlooking sea of orange-clad ninja almost came as a welcome reassurance. It was to be expected for him to be attacked after being revealed like that. It was the way he would have done it himself, were the roles reversed. Of course, the forest around him being completely orange with the amount of clones perching on branches and crowding the trees was a new one. Once, in the far gone past, Naruto had come to accept that his trademark charges of massive hordes of shadow clones hadn't been any use except to waste a skilled fighter's time. Or, to put it in the words of Kiba, who'd been taunting him at the time, 1,000 times nothing is still nothing. Spurred on by that comment as much as anything, the repeating boy had knuckled down and trained until he was as good as the Ninja Academy could make him. Then he'd learned that a fighter of Orochimaru's caliber didn't even notice the difference between slaughtering thousands of skilled genin over having slaughtered the same numbers of unskilled berserkers. However, he'd never tried the mass charges of a few thousand effectively Chunin grade fighters against Orochimaru before. The massive clone army roared and charged. From the very first moment Orochimaru knew something was wrong. The second he saw the forest around him was orange with ninja clones, he'd swept blood over the seals tattooed onto his arms to summon Manda. Only nothing happened. No surge of chakra, no smoke, no fizzle, nothing. The amazing thing was, with no more evidence than that, the snake Chunin was skilled enough to figure out almost exactly what had occurred. Seals had been placed all around forest to stop summoning techniques, including most of his snake-based moves, as he didn't have those serpents concealed under his sleeves or down his throat most of the time. He learned almost immediately afterwards that the same kind of thing was also in place to stop body switches or flickers, as his very next trick was to try to flicker out of there, and that failed in the very same way. It took less than half a second for the Chunin to perform both tests, and in that moment discern that this was an assassination attempt. They'd only built that village because they'd wanted to mock him before he died, just as he was planning to do to his old teacher Sarutobi, crushing all his hopes and dreams so he could watch them die in his eyes before finishing him off. Only Orochimaru had no intention of going down himself so easily. His first attempt was the by now expected great breakthrough technique, a wind jutsu that Orochimaru could and had used before to level trees in a wide cone before him, tearing up everything in its path, aimed at taking out a large chunk of the onrushing clones to grant him room to maneuver. Naruto actually countered that one, unraveling the jutsu before it could even form. Countering techniques was not done well or often by most ninja, as it required both a knowledge ahead of time of what technique the other guy was using, a folk knowledge most often possessed only by Sharingan users, or time loopers, but also complete mastery of that technique yourself, which was something almost no Sharingan users could be bothered learning. Still smoking from the explosion he'd been through, and that Naruto's clones had been at a sufficient distance to avoid, Orochimaru was nevertheless impressed. To see a successful counter to one of your techniques was one of the warning signs you were up against a real pro. There were several ranks of ninja for a reason. Genin weren't too tough. Even so, they had some rather distinct advantages over an ordinary civilian, and though they did not know many chakra-fueled techniques, the basic academy set could be devastating if used well. Still, very few genin fought at precisely the same level, just as you wouldn't expect to walk into a math class, say algebra, and find that all students there had the same grades, despite being technically on the same level by virtue of being at the same rank of math. Some would be better, some worse, and most would find some parts easier than others. It was the way of human nature, the way of existence. You could group people however you wanted, but you couldn't force them to be exactly the same, not even if you were specifically trying. So to speak of a high genin or low chunin was a perfectly accurate way of describing the situation. Even a guy failing trig knew more math than the one getting an A in remedial arithmetic. But the guy with an A was farther ahead than the ones getting CS or DS in the same class, just like the guy failing trig was behind those passing his course. Also, people progressed through those grades. Someone on their first week of geometry wasn't going to have all the same knowledge as a student taking their last week of that same course. People starting out were not going to be as good at what they were doing as people who'd been doing it for a while. If they didn't progress, you couldn't promote them to new grades. Your best chunin are the only place to look when it's time to recruit new jonin. Also, there were different things to be measured, and your grades in math didn't necessarily do anything for you if you were failing English. Or you might be in grade school yet have a college-level reading ability. It happens. So your chunin level ninja might have academy-level illusion skills, or your genin might be such a prodigy at close combat that he could match or beat most jonin. However, just as you'd expect a calculus student to be further along on math than the guys in algebra, certain broad categories did exist and were helpful in their way, and most genin could beat up most civilians. Chunin and jonin were tougher still, each leagues above the rank below them. But that path of progression was fairly well known and described by now, just more of what made the genin different than an ordinary human. But the Kijis and S-class criminals all had something to separate them from the rest of the ninja population, and it wasn't something so simple as a jutsu or bloodline. The lower ranks had those in plenty. No, what really separated an S-class ninja from the rest of the herd was certain unique skills, like countering others' techniques, and including their almost universal ability to multitask, to do more than one thing at the same time, whether that be to fight and use jutsu at the same time, or to mix different elemental techniques, casting them at the same moment. There was always something special there placing them above the rest. A jonin like Kakashi or Guy could beat you down or fry your bones with jutsu, but they typically had a gap between doing either, even if that was only the pause in mid-jump, and only the better ones could manage that. Naruto had not forgotten how Kakashi fought Zabuza, standing there, feet set in a wide stance that allowed him to focus his concentration on doing a long set of hand seals. He could fight, or he could use jutsu, but not both at the same time. He even had to take a moment out to pause to power up his trademark Thousand Birds. Only then, once it was active, could he charge into combat maintaining it, and even so, he demanded a bloodline to keep him accurate. A genin cast his jutsu in mostly the same way. There was no substantial difference between Kakashi standing there frozen in a stance working hand seals or Shikamaru doing the same. The basics were identical. And though one could argue that Kakashi had more experience, he wasn't even substantially faster than the lazy genin, when said lazy genin actually chose to perform them. But you go after a Kij and you're likely to discover he can fling two jutsu at the same time. Not just one after another done fast, but invoked at the same moment. Like a man fighting with two weapons could launch attacks from two completely different directions in the same instant. Sarutobi, and Orochimaru like him, could stand there flinging 4 or 5 jutsu at the same time, if they felt particularly pressed in combat. It ate chakra like nobody's business, so they performed it rarely, but they could both do it. Naruto understood that doing your jutsu without seals was a precursor to that jaw-dropping ability. And it wasn't something a Sharingan could copy. If it could, every Uchiha in existence would have had that capability. But Kakashi demonstrably did not have it, and if anyone had made a name out of stealing techniques and abilities, he had. He'd also hung around people who could do it for a substantial portion of his life, and he'd never failed to steal anything he'd liked before. Heck, the Jonin had no shame, even stealing Lee's fighting style to teach to his butt-sucking toady, when Lee was an allied ninja, and his fighting arts were literally all he'd had. You steal from an ally and take all he has, no one can claim honor in that. It was as low as one could go, and did a real injury to the victim's life goals of proving that hard work mattered, sneering in his face as you proved they did not, that hard work only produced something for a lazy genius to consume. That wasn't just an injury, it was also insulting. And you don't go injuring and insulting allies if you ever expect to keep them. No, Kakashi was sure the hard worker was insignificant and didn't matter, and that attitude had found its perfect match in Sasuke, who felt sure that no one else was as significant as he, and that only he mattered in the end. Tsunade was right. The Uchiha heir was an outright danger to Konoha, and his proud but lazy teacher doting on him only made things worse. However, at the moment, Naruto had a fight to devote his attention to. Orochimaru's Earth Rampart was something of an expected move against the literal hail of Senbon and Kunai the onrushing clones had sent in ahead of them. That the Snake Sunin rode his giant wall high above the actual ground level, granting him a bird's-eye view of the field, was also pretty standard. That was why it came as so sweet a surprise to see the look on his face as that massive defense transformed into mud underneath him, dropping the Sunin from a height of several hundred feet, the mud too gooey to stick to as it itself collapsed and brought him down. Orochimaru came down hard because he couldn't flicker out of there, nor did it help to walk on mud blocks that were falling themselves. He got back up in record speed, but by that time the wall of onrushing clones had reached him and suddenly it was all knives and swords and rapid tail strikes on all sides. Most fighting styles start with a couple of good ideas put into application by someone who used them, learned how to apply them well, and ironed out their weaknesses, then taught them to others. Those styles grew and changed and matured over generations as more got added, older parts released from use or forgotten, and new parts explored. Through this process, some arts grew weaker as demands lessened or masters grew more concerned with artistic movements instead of effective ones, or the attrition of combat sharpened that art by exposure into far more deadly forms. A martial art was distilled combat experience, refined and explored, and the more combat experience you got the more deadly your art could eventually be, and the Kitsune clan had been neck-deep in combat for so long it was a bit hard to remember what peace was like, when you weren't expecting an invasion anytime soon. And, unlike most arts, the masters developing this one could correct for failure in unheard of ways. A lot of potential combat learning was lost due to defeats that render you unable to record what you'd learned, and the Kitsune did not currently have that problem. They could correct for fatal mistakes in ways no one else could dream of, and through that course take risks no one else would contemplate, trying out experiments no others would dare. The Kitsune clan art had begun with some great ideas, borrowed even more, and then been sharpened in combat against a wide variety of ninja, including some truly awesome foes, as Tenten refined it until it was really quite scary. But she still only viewed it as half an art. The other half they would have to develop only after gaining stronger bodies. Lee and Guy both helped, but they didn't have the Kite-Shun bloodline and its modifications to their bodies that the art was designed to take advantage of. So, while they could help project out some of those moves, plot for what improvements to make down the line, and refine higher forms than Tenten or the girls could presently practice, the real art itself couldn't develop any more useful ability until the clan members had stronger bodies, able to take advantage of higher level techniques or more demanding forms. Of course, Kite-Shun's style was already a large and complex art. Most styles were constrained to a bare few core skills they could afford to teach to all members. But, given their time loop, that was not a problem for Clan Kite-Shun's current members, who had nearly infinite time to practice in. And, given Naruto's training illusions, that was not a problem they expected to have for their kids, either. So it could afford to be a large art, with many moves and options. And, oddly enough, that made it unpredictable, which was somehow fitting for a clan based on the traits of a trickster. Whether that trickster was Naruto or the fox was open to debate, however. No, really, the time had come to graduate their family style and admit that it had already emerged as a fully developed martial art. And what better way to do that than face off against Orochimaru using it? Alone, without any ninja tools or support, no allies, no summons, and deprived of some of his favorite techniques, Orochimaru was as vulnerable as he was ever going to be. Combined, those were almost as much of a handicap for him as being without an arm would have been. A perfect baptism of fire to stress test the new Kite-Shun clan art. Those disadvantages wouldn't be enough to transform it into a fully martial arts battle, as no serious ninja fight was ever truly a martial arts battle. They had too many additional tricks. One side or the other would always mix in whatever would grant them an advantage. But a martial art that couldn't cope with ninja techniques wasn't suitable for use by ninja. No, the perfect ninja martial art was one that could flawlessly incorporate as many of those as possible while maintaining its close combat edge. However, all Naruto was hoping to achieve here was any kind of martial arts exchange at all. Mostly the Chunin would just tear him to shreds with his vast arsenal of ninja and elemental techniques. Or, if the blonde was doing really well, slash him apart with a sword. But being chopped to bits by something that could carve up just about anything wasn't a true test of skill. The Snake Chunin's style all those times Naruto had waged ninja war against him in that forest had been based on high mobility as much as techniques of vast destruction. So for Orochimaru to fight without the use of his sword, rapid changes of location on the battlefield, or any of his summons, small or large, was a significant handicap. Yes, he could adapt. But, no, he wouldn't be at his best. Nor were any of his usual surprise tricks the least bit surprising to the boy whose thousands of clones descended upon him in a giant orange tide. And, to add insult on top of the injuries he'd already suffered, Orochimaru found their fight being accompanied by the William Tell overture. The Chunin struck out lightning fast, far quicker than Naruto could ever expect to go during these loops, and stuck his hand through a clone's head only to learn that particular clone was an illusion, just as two others were stabbing at his unprotected back and flanks. Orochimaru cut their heads off with his tongue, then got cross-eyed as the lightning jutsu contained in their flesh grounded through his tongue into the Chunin's brain. Electrical aura armor was obvious, and an obvious defense would be avoided. But Naruto had learned the Thunder Punch technique for charging one's fists or weapons with an electrical charge long ago, and it wasn't much of a modification to charge his neck instead, and that was one of the Chunin's favorite targets. Of course, that didn't do much other than short his brain just long enough for a hail of kunai to come down, all trailing ninja wires and exploding tags. The explosion was a truly withering fireball that lit up the forest all around, and the lighting coursing down those wires as it went off made it doubly entertaining, as the electrical attacks reached the sun before burning off. This was a many-tiered assault, with front ranks of Naruto clones rushing in and out to engage in combat, back off or reinforce as needed, then others standing behind those to launch distance attacks, either massed thrown weapons a la Tenten, or ninja techniques. Seeing as how Anko was the one who'd taught Naruto the importance of ninja tools, and he figured she was likely to have learned something of that from her teacher, one of the many Narutos who were not directly engaging him in combat used his naked in public technique, real version, on Orochimaru to disintegrate his clothes, and with them his many secret pockets, depriving him of useful tools, hidden weapons or other surprises, as it also ripped the shed skin disguise off. The blonde boy noted that his enemy's current body was female, something that not even the Sound 4 had been informed of. Interesting. He'd puzzled out from watching Sarutabi's fights against him that the snake Chunin was jumping around possessing bodies as his form of immortality, but he'd somehow missed that detail. He'd have to figure out a prank to base off of it later. Orochimaru had one distinct advantage over anyone else fighting against someone using the clan Kitsune style. He himself had developed for his own use the body stretching techniques that made their tail strikes so flexible and deadly, so they were less unpredictable to him, and easier to avoid. Still, the fundamental principle of the style still applied. Most people had two hands, so could only cope with using two weapons at once, so their training only applied to countering two. The third came in almost unopposed. Then again, Orochimaru was one of the Chunin. He'd fought outnumbered against multiple opponents before. It was expected at his rank, and there was not much difference between dodging 3 strikes from 3 people or 3 strikes all from one foe. Then again, 9 strikes simultaneously from 3 people was a bit much to ask, and the snake Chunin kept having trouble trying. There is only so much data the mind can process at once, and too much can overload it. That's one of the best benefits of training. Any familiar situation requires very little in the way of mental processing power to cope with. So a person who has fought against double weapon styles or multiple opponents in training was not going to freeze up facing those in real-life situations. He may not win, but he stands a better chance. On the other hand, dealing with the strange or unusual, the unexpected or stuff you hadn't encountered before often leads to what? Moments that can get even veteran ninja killed. Surprise was deadly, and being unprepared for something was almost a guarantee of getting slaughtered by it on the first few encounters. So it was with Orochimaru. He'd trained under the best instructor the village of Konoha had ever seen. He'd faced, both in training and in combat, most everything that the ninja of the elemental nations could throw at him. But it had not included this, and that meant the first couple of strikes went through despite his impressive defenses. Of course, Orochimaru had a freakish damage tolerance, able to stand up and fight on after at least 10 minutes of brutal pounding bites unit going at full strength. Most ninja would be paced after such an experience, heck most would be gone after the first blow. He was merely wobbly after minutes of her punching him in the face. Such a ninja did not go down easily, and he had that ability to repair all damage by shedding his skin. Naruto had even gotten lucky 1 or twice and cut off the snake Chunin's head, only to have a whole, new, unblemished Orochimaru jump out of the old one's mouth before the decapitated body hit the floor. So he wasn't going to be stopped by anything so simple as 1,000 birds or 2 to the face, or a spiraling sphere to the gut, or even lightning whips cutting off all of his limbs. Orochimaru only put up with this for a moment before the Chunin grinned and exploded like a shrapnel bomb into millions of little snake darts, flying in every direction, acting like a million poisoned senbon, each one bearing a tiny little Orochimaru face overbared and glistening fangs. The nearest Naruto clones, alerted by their whiskers to the impending blast, all flew into heavenly spin techniques, shredding the snake darts that came towards them using the Hyuga's ultimate defense. Others, in the next few ranks, having a little more warning, let fly with withering return blasts of fire, wind and lightning jutsu, burning through countless little Orochi snakes. Still a few dozen or couple hundred, an insignificant fraction of the whole of them, burst free of the radius of the counterstrikes and went wriggling off through the brush in all directions, some leaping in the ears of forest animals and possessing them, turning back into full-size, half-beast clones of Orochimaru that returned to combat the Naruto clones that hunted the rest of them. "We haven't seen that one before," Ino commented to her friends as all the angels watched this fight from a safe distance. "It's almost certainly a desperation technique," Tsunade observed. "If it follows the normal pattern for those, he can probably only pull it off once without meeting some significant recharge requirement. So he'd not pull it out unless in cases like this, when his life is actually at stake. He couldn't keep shedding his skin forever. That's got to take chakra." Was his life actually at stake? Tenten questioned. "Orochimaru's beaten Naruto countless times before. What I want to know is where he got that technique," Yugao observed. "Probably invented it himself, as one of his many attempts at immortality, then kept it on as a useful desperation technique." Tsunade scowled, still watching the fight through her glasses. "What I want to know is, are all those millions of him real? If he created this as an offshoot of his immortality research, they might be," Anko commented unhappily. "He'd want real copies of him to continue on. But he wouldn't be happy about having to share power with millions of other identical clones of himself. So he wouldn't use it lightly. Certain people just don't know how to share power," Hana disapproved. "Once more the Chunin gets away," Teiya breathed regretfully, lowering her binoculars. "He's not clear yet," Anko growled, still looking through hers. "Why would you think Naruto doesn't have him?" Hinata wondered. "Something Naruto taught me once, long ago," Tenten answered for the other girls. "Force concentration. He explained that my abilities with thrown weapons and his clone making were capable of acting in concert to be much greater than either one alone, that I could only throw so many weapons and that he could only crowd so many clones into fist range, but that together a mob of clones throwing weapons delivered far more force than either of our signature moves could do separately. A moment ago, Naruto was focusing the close, mid and long-ranged fighting efforts of 4,000 clones onto a single target, and Orochimaru was weakening, getting beaten severely. But now the Chunin has split them up, forced them to divide their efforts. So it is no longer so uneven a deal." The animated body of Zabuza grunted. "It is the difference between my hitting a foe with the flat of my blade versus the edge. The one will bruise him up, the other cut him in half. It is the same blow, but the edge delivers a lot more concentrated force." But Orochimaru was not in the clear yet, as there were just as many Narutos hunting him as there were Orochimarus trying to escape. The technique did deprive Naruto of the ability to focus all of his power directed on the Chunin, but that didn't make escape easy. One of the mini Orochimarus had leapt into the body of a bear, and just as it was finished reforming into his own body, one of Naruto's clones stepped up, this one wearing head-to-toe black armor along with a flowing black cape. Then Naruto activated a weapon he'd gone to some lengths to retrieve. Just as the blade of lightning formed above the hilt, he spoke deeply through the breath mask built into his stylized faceplate. I've been waiting for you, Snake Sanin. We meet again, at last. The circuit is now complete. When I left you I was but the learner, now I am the master. I. Things were bustling at the Uchiha estate, as what with all of the work that had been done in the Forest of Death, building the replica of Sound Village there, they had been forced to put off transforming the property into the Kitesun clan compound, and were eager to catch up on their work. So it was that clones were running everywhere over the property, getting things put together, tearing down buildings they didn't want, or that needed to be reformed in a manner better suited to their style of living. The tech summoning experiments were going well. And, in spite of time being exactly the same for the meat reset, Naruto had found, to his and others' massive frustration, that even in a perfect loop, doing things exactly the same way each time, he could not be guaranteed of getting the same tech each time he tried to. Heck, the people who were not in the reset, those summoning experts in the town, weren't getting the same things each reset, and they couldn't vary their methods, because the time loops wouldn't let them. This had led to speculation as to what was the problem, and their best guess so far was that this art, summoning as it did tech from other universes, was reaching out for places beyond the scope of the resets, where time was not frozen. So each time they posed the problem, they got a different answer. It was like a fisherman frozen through time, repeating the same actions as he came to the pond, baited his hook, and made the cast, but because the fish in the pond were not frozen in time, what he caught was different. It also solved resoundingly several long-standing questions concerning the practice of summoning technology, and why it was so hard to control. And the answer was that not all of the variables were controlled by the seals they'd been using. Some of it was on the other end. If you stand a blindfolded man on a boat and have him fire an arrow, even if he has perfect control of his stance, the tension on the string, the release, and the angle of his shot, his aim will be off if the boat is moving and rocking about, because he can't see to compensate for all that motion. Having no idea about the specifics, or whereabouts, of the universes they were summoning things out from, what they got, or if they got anything, was randomized by factors beyond their control. However, it did land them some excellent movies, including that one series called Star Wars, that no one else had seen before. And that amount of newness and randomness was contributing relief to everyone's lives. And an amusing prank or two on Orochimaru. There was also a certain amount of behind-the-scenes prep work going on for the ongoing plots and pranks and battle against Orochimaru, and for that one clone had shapeshifted himself into a copy of Sasuke Uchiha, to serve as bait to a later trap for the Sannin. Now one thing here that must be understood, with so many of them aware of the resets, a certain amount of variableness had crept into life. It was not that those unaware of the loops changed what they were doing without help, but with so many people who were aware out there doing things, small cues kept getting given to everyone else that did sometimes lead to different actions cropping up, seemingly out of nowhere. For one example, there was a fairly consistent case of if someone bought groceries on the day of moving into the Uchiha estate, through a complicated series of events and rumors, they would draw Sasuke Uchiha to the estate to whine and complain about them vandalizing it, making an increasing fuss, and even trying to get Anbu summoned to throw them out if not dealt with promptly. Since purchasing groceries was a difficult thing to avoid, as no one had enough food in their cupboards to feed as large a group as they'd become, and other events got set into motion if they all visited restaurants, having Sasuke around the estates on the first day making a pill of himself was becoming an increasingly common nuisance. It was something they were still seeking a good way to avoid. However, in a world without consequences it was always easy to knock him out and hide the body, or erase his memory so no one got stuck with the duty of impersonating the amazing walking ego. Still, seeing Anko rush at him with 1,000 birds around one fist, Anko had a very flexible definition of knocking out when it came to the Uchiha. The clone who was impersonating Sasuke dodged backwards, without even thinking about it, the shadow clone activating his Sharingan as he did so purely by reflex. Then the clone paused, stunned, and Anko nailed him with the 1,000 birds right between the eyes, an action which brought the whole clone workforce to a halt as the memories of that clone hit them. Suddenly dozens of them shapeshifted in the dread Uchiha emo pants, and were activating Sharingans. This was odd enough that Anko figured out what had happened almost immediately, and thus didn't go about slaughtering them all. "What is it?" Hinata asked, flustered at the odd happenstance of the Naruto she was talking to suddenly dropping the conversation to turn into the Uchiha, and stare about with an activated Sharingan. "Two things," the boy replied to his most beloved, although he didn't hug her while transformed into an Uchiha as that would be too creepy. "One is, for the very first time since transplanting a Sharingan so long ago, I tried to shapeshift one, and it worked beyond my expectations. I have a functional set of copy wheel eyes in this form." Hinata pondered a moment whether this was a good or bad thing, as she rather liked their normal eyes, and they could always steal Sasuke's whenever they wanted to memorize something. It wasn't like they had a better use for the Pooh wielder. "And the other thing is that," the boy pointed to one of the many fans decorating the former Uchiha compound, decorations they'd always taken care to tear down on the first day of rebuilding. Indeed, half were already gone, cleared away for the Kitsune compound construction project. Seeing it was just a normal fan, she presumed something deeper, activating her own white eyes to check. "I don't understand," she replied. "There is a slash across it, covered by a permanent illusion seal." "But why?" "All of the fans have a different slash, among those I've seen," Naruto calmly replied. "But those aren't random, they are strokes of an incomplete sealing array, scattered across the Uchiha clan fan decorations." Hinata pondered this for a moment, before coming to an answer. "The Uchiha clan library. They'd want to hide it so only they could find it." "And what makes them unique?" "The Sharingan," Naruto confirmed, nodding with a grin. "So they set up a puzzle that only an active Sharingan could solve, as a test for anyone who wanted to get into their library. First, you had to see through the illusions over those concealed marks, but the Hyugas could also do that. So they split up the code among many such illusions," Hinata blurted for him. "To require the Sharingan's ability to memorize." She now quoted from her own burgeoning education on sealing. "Seals are such tricky things that you can't afford to get one close enough, it has to be done just right. So the precise marks and their relations to each other, scattered across so many fans, would be all but impossible for anyone but an Uchiha to put together right." Naruto smirked, folding his arms. "And Kakashi, who was the only one who could have discovered this riddle, didn't, because for one he never comes out here, and for the fact that he always keeps his eye covered." Hinata was already mumbling. "But, if the key is a seal, that would mean that their library is hidden inside of a giant storage seal somewhere, and this key would provide access, like a summoning jutsu, only reversed. You'd have to call yourself into it, or call the books out, I suppose." The boy reverted back to his native form and hugged the girl. "That's right. And because I didn't know anything about seals those first few times I tore this place down to the bedrock, I had no idea what I was looking for. They are probably carved between layers on some floor someplace, and I just never knew what to check for the first couple of times, and just knew there was nothing there ever since. This means we get the Uchiha clan library. She enthused, kissing the boy she loved while hugging him back. His clones were already at work reconstructing the kaleidoscope seals that offered access to the giant and mysterious library, assembling the strokes from the various remaining fan symbols around the compound, only to find that despite the redundancy put in by the Uchiha to keep the scheme viable in spite of expected battle damage, that they'd already destroyed enough of those fan symbols during the early stages of the reconstruction to make that impossible. This reset. The original Naruto pulled on the sleeves of his ornate silk kimono, poorly fit and badly tailored by his estimate, still it fit the standards of the Fire Lord's court, where he was presently standing, waiting to be introduced. It was a fairly straightforward act on his part, play up his tailoring ability enough, and the Fire Lord wanted him withdrawn as a ninja so he could be engaged to one of his many daughters. Well, you don't do that to some country bumpkin without giving him some instruction on how to behave at court functions. The tailor may be a simple tradesman, less than a farmer, someone you'd always want to keep hidden in the back somewhere making those excellent clothes you'd snagged him for, but if he's to marry your daughter that still elevates him to the samurai class, and he's got to know how to behave decently. So, instead of spending all his time running away from the Fire Lord's troops, this time he was embracing that instruction. Now when this happened before, it had always come as a surprise to Naruto, to have the local lord's retainers descending on the ninja village to say, him. That boy there. The Fire Lord requires his service. And consequently he'd been drummed out of the active service ninja corps and the reset came. Now. Well, it was different when a humble boy approached the palace and applied for the position of the Lord's tailor. Then he didn't have to send his retainers to go collect you, and consequently they did not even know they needed to have you removed from the active duty ninja roster. So, while his clones were off making things happen in Konoha, the real Naruto could go get some education about the royal court. And so long as it was more than a month, a week, and a day before the wedding ceremony, he'd probably never even have to see the ugly girl he was engaged to. In the meantime, he could be learning court etiquette and how to comport himself among their samurai lords. And, well, if he came back and used that information later, on another reset, he could truly start to master the delicate art of politics that went on there. And sooner or later, he'd learn how to get someone to teach him the samurai fighting arts, whether they wanted to or not. If they would not teach a poor and humble tailor, how about a more well-mannered cook? Or a slightly more refined master? Or a downright sophisticated weaponsmith? He had loads of skills this court had tried to recruit him over, and would be learning their manners, habits and peculiar court culture more and more each reset. A month of learning here, a month there, and pretty soon they'd take him for one of them. And even if they only started to teach their backwards country cousin, fallen into poverty, a few moves here or there, that would build until he was not so poor at fighting or backward in his skills until he could pass as merely not so well taught, and a refinement or two could be wheedled out to suit the Lord's future son-in-law. No, it would not be long until he had full samurai training. They might not ever teach their best secrets to him, but they'd show him the basics. Even Konoha gave that much ninja training to descendants of their enemies, or missing ninja. As for the monks, well, most of them were retired samurai, weren't they? With the size of the forest of death and the number of Orochimarus loose in it, it was inevitable that some of the micro-sanins escape. Once out past the boundary fence, it once again became possible for him to body flicker and summon. Manda made an attack upon Konoha in that very instant. Before anyone could react, the office of the Hokage fell under the assault of dozens of Orochimarus who overwhelmed the guards and slaughtered the third, wasting no time in mocking or isolating him as they were too busy competing with each other over who got to kill him and claim the prize in an unofficial contest. The Orochimaru to kill the third got to rule the others. Naturally, none of the Orochimarus kept their agreements with the winner, and the town of Konoha was badly damaged before the Konoha ninja chased the last one out. But mysteriously the Chunin exams did not get called off. Apparently the town council was too busy passing new laws and increasing their power to even consider official ninja business like electing a new Hokage or calling off the exams. Naruto watched grimly and made sure to memorize all the new laws. Seriously, Naruto reported. Sarutobi dies in almost every reset. We don't go to extreme lengths to save him. But this is the first time we've seen what the aftermath of that is, and it's all a power grab by those old advisors of his and the civilian members of the council. Scary people. Naruto shook his head as he looked over his copies of the new laws, and it's obvious they've been waiting for him to kick the bucket for a long time, just so they could pull some of this stuff in his absence. The third Hokage put in his two teammates back from his genin days as his advisors, and they've opposed him on virtually every issue since, longer than I've been alive. The boy sighed, leaning back and tossing his hands behind his head. But the scary thing is, just like a ninja gets experience fighting in the field, and if he survives gets more dangerous, these two have built up nearly a century of political maneuvering and backbiting. My sponsor in the Fire Lord's court was careful to point out to me that the older a successful politician, the more scary and dangerous he was. And these two advisors are as old as Sarutobi. Not only that, they've been in politics as long as he was. The only person with their experience who felt like opposing them was the third Hokage himself. None of their other rivals has any place close to their skill. And that plus their wrong-headed ideas is a real problem. So what are the old bats up to? Anko drawled, leaning on a sofa arm while eating dango off a stick. It was back to clan conference time, so everybody had gathered around. Well, the boy considered, lifting papers left and right. Let me put it this way, they've been opposed to you being ninja since Orochimaru defected, and me since I was born, have advocated our deaths as untrustworthy elements, are total Sasuke fangirls, and really love that old warhawk dancer. They'd like to turn this place, together with him, into another bloody village like Mist. It really ticked them off that Sarutobi preferred peaceful solutions. He palmed his face and started rubbing it with his hands to get the stress out. Basically, if Sarutobi wanted one thing, these guys are pressing for the total opposite in every department, and always have, which scares me as the third Hokage has led us longer than all other Hokages combined and we're still around and near the top of our heap. So he must be doing something right. I'd be more worried if the Fire Lord was listening to the embassy these guys have sent to his court. But so far he has them cooling their heels. The boy leaned on an arm, picking up one of the law papers to limply drop it back on the desk. The council has always been a nuisance to the Hokage, but Sarutobi tolerated that. Only it's never been as powerful as these two are making it since he died. Between their near century of experience and these new laws they're passing, they'd steamroller any new replacement Hokage. Also, this guy Danza scares me. I never cared about politics before, but he has these two advisors in his pocket, and more political maneuvering behind the scenes than most guys would know what to do with. He's dangerous, and he's got his own private army to back him up that nobody knew about till now, and keeping secrets that large in a ninja village speaks of scary ability. Tsunade nodded. I've run into him before. Once, back in the day, he basically wanted me to sign over all voting rights of my clan to him, and our lands and everything else as well. He's tried direct action, bribery, give him my clan's wealth and influence, and he'd work to ensure my liberty, and even trying to force through arranged marriages to a selection of his cronies. Seeing she had the stunned views of the clan on her, including her original apprentice Shitsune, the Chunin simply shrugged. He's made closer to 30 attempts than 3, everything from getting me drunk so they could try to get me laid, to more romantic efforts. None of them even got close before I pounded his latest Romeo into the dust. But lately, when I've been working on reconstructing limbs and repairing old battle damage for improving the lives of Konoha's retired ninja, he wanted the techniques used only on him, and the sycophants of his he chose to reward. The legendary medic gave a tired smile over to Teiya, who glowed, having just gained official medic status in the clan's eyes after developing a bone regeneration technique based on her study of Kimimro's bloodline ability to grow and manipulate the bones in his body. It wasn't a full bloodline theft, not yet anyway, but it already had massive medical application, resolving a long-term weakness of the ninja medical arts. Heck, already it could restore considerable strength to old bodies, making the bones tough and strong again, reduced some of the frailties of old age. By no means all, there was organ damage and things, but it did much. They were planning to try it out on Sarutobi the next couple of resets to see how much, because not only should it have significant impact on improving the guy's quality of life, but it ought to make him significantly harder to kill when next Orochimaru came around hunting him if Sarutobi wasn't physically weaker than a genin. At this point they were planning to use it on Danza and the 2 advisors, never. But no one knew how to refuse Sarutobi if he insisted. Probably, if they couldn't give the treatment to him without withholding it from those cretins, they'd stop giving it to the Hokage. Not strengthening their enemies was a big deal to the Kitsune clan. Shitsune whistled, impressed with the man's audacity. If he could control the techniques we've been working on, he'd have every retired or disabled ninja in his pockets, willing to do anything for him to acquire your services. He'd own this town in short order. Tsunade nodded soberly. Whereas if I tried the same arm-twisting tactics as he would, trying to force influence by controlling my own treatments, he'd have me hauled before the council for breaking the same power-mongering statutes it turns out he's been flouting with that private army of his. Only he somehow manages to get away with it, and I wouldn't. Naruto slumped, holding his chin in his hands and frowning. And Sarutobi dies in almost every reset. Even if we save him from that, he's still old. He's going to die sometime, and it looks like these guys will outlast him. So we're looking at the future of Konoha here in what they want to do to it. The clan shuddered. That was scary. Naruto sighed, picking himself up and making 1,000 clones. All right guys. Go read the laws of this village. All of them. Let's see if we can get some kind of legal basis to stop these guys take over. I don't fancy fighting the ninja of our own village just to save it from a few power-mad old fogies. Right. The clones shouted, flickering off to a collection of old dusty record collections and libraries, trying to sound more excited than they felt about it. So how did you end up shapeshifting a Sharingan? Ino pressed, changing the subject to one she found more interesting. I'd guess it's since the Sharingan was a part of his body, even for a short time, he has experience using it, thus he knows how it should work, and thus he might have subconsciously found a way for his shapeshift to make it functional. Shitsune speculated. Very much like when you had to eat rabbits to learn how to turn into one, the Kyuubi agreed. You can't truly take any form, you have to have some connection, an innate understanding of how that form works, if you will. So, when I transplanted the Sharingan long ago, Naruto wondered out loud. your body's regeneration would have gone to work trying to integrate it, the fox spirit answered, yawning. And that would have put you on the path to memorizing how it works, for later copying of it. But I'm surprised you got it out of a simple transplant, unless you had it for months. Usually it takes more information than that. Now I understand it. The boy cried aloud, smacking his fist into his palm. For I dunno how long afterwards, I had all these cravings to have and use a Sharingan again. It was almost uncontrollable. It was all I could do not to run out and knock Kakashi or Sasuke over the head to steal theirs again. I put that down to the Sharingan being addictive. It might be. The demoness yawned once again. But I can also see your foxy nature wanting more familiarity with those eyes so it could copy the bloodline powers without the extra years of piecing the functions together from incomplete information. Still, she shifted in place to find a more comfortable spot on her cushion. You should experiment to see if you can learn to just shift the eyes and relevant parts, or if you'll always have to shift your entire body. Sharingan. Naruto activated the eyes, then looked down on himself, grinning goofily as he saw his own body there. Then his face went slack and he stated, drooling, body falling limp. Naruto. All of his angels cried out in concern. Surprisingly, with all of the expert medics involved, it was Hana who figured out the problem. Many of them had, in turn, decided to check out his mind with the Yamanaka clan techniques when it was diagnosed that his body was perfectly healthy. But she was the one to make the connection between the intense traffic of his senses and the virtual inactivity of his higher thinking. From that they were able to determine the problem. The big disadvantage of the Sharingan, other than its activation requirement, was that it was a resource hog, grabbing ever larger portions of the brain's processing power and memory to operate itself, and it wouldn't release them without some external reset. Merely turning it off wasn't enough. Also, while operating, it was continually spewing out urges, programming its user to call upon its functions for ever more tasks, making the wielder more and more dependent upon it for all he did. This can be taken advantage of. The more one used of it, the greater a portion of your mind's potential it subverted to its own tasks and subroutines, releasing those only when the Sharingan itself was uninstalled was the only proper word for it. Normally, the mind has such vast processing power and memory this drain could be tolerated, to a degree, although the person would show increasing signs of aberrant behavior, gradually leading to insanity. In Naruto's case this was far more extreme than normal. Since the Sharingan grants itself a greater priority over the resources of your mind than your own thoughts, a phenomena can be created which the Sharingan feels an infinite need to analyze, and thus consumes all mental resources forever. A Sharingan user faced with such a thing will find his mind caught up in an infinite loop, unable to respond to anything else, and if left alone will gradually die of starvation. Naruto had, luckily or unluckily, discovered this more or less by accident merely by looking at his belt pouches with the special ready access storage seals he'd created. When the Sharingan caught a glimpse of them it began trying to decipher what it felt was the underlying nature of the universe and started to analyze this, a task far beyond all mortal comprehension. So it froze his mind solid, locking up all resources, tying them to a task that could not be completed in an infinite number of lifetimes. The copy wheel eyes had taken such a strong control of Naruto's mind that nothing they could do could break the hold. So 1 month of failed attempts later, Anko was forced to pronounce him medically unfit to continue the Chunin exam, forcing the reset, which luckily for all rebooted his mind. There had been substantial fear that it wouldn't, not even putting out his eyes had helped, as the supporting nerves had already tied his brain to priority tasks from which they would not release it, and Tsunade had been unwilling to lobotomize Naruto, cutting out his optic nerves and several lobes, to try a cure when the reset might work. But without nervous support shapeshifted for a Sharingan, his brain had been able to restore itself to normal function. Experiments with Sasuke, having shown him one of those seals while he had his Sharingan active, then chopping up his brain to see what they had to cut out in order to fix the problem, had been promising, so they'd hoped, and it would be Tsunade's task to continue to do so until they had a cure, lest this same thing occur when they didn't have the resets to protect them. But it wasn't a cure anyone was anxious to need, regeneration or no. Hana would later research the cause of the Sharingan-induced mental lockup and learn to duplicate it deliberately. There were, after all, several Sharingan users out there who were not too friendly to the Kitsune clan. During that month they still had Naruto's 1,000 clones that had been formed to go memorize the village's law, however, along with sundry others that had been formed to go do other tasks like see to their armor and refit the clan compound, and they got to most of those in time and told them not to disperse themselves before they could possibly avoid it. Doing this they learned several things about the longevity of clones, and it was closely tied to the amount of chakra they had. Clones could not generate any of their own, and when they ran out they died. So this spurred on several attempts to jumpstart techniques for chakra transferal so Naruto's angels could keep the clones of their husband around longer, increasingly desperate attempts as the real one did not wake up no matter what they could do, and the clones that had been using a ton of ninja techniques vanished. Still, to their great relief, they had a happy ending, although developed a near paranoia about careless use of the Sharingan, as they'd seen that it could shut one of them down forever to glimpse the wrong thing with it, and they were using a lot of those special storage seals as they were so useful. They also learned that while they had shapeshifted a Sharingan they did not also have the Hyuga white eyes they'd grown so accustomed to, and which their fighting style depended on. It was one ability or the other, not both, and the Kyuubi assured them it would always remain that way. The Kitsune shapeshift could only copy what existed, and making up new stuff like a combination of the Hyuga and Uchiha vision powers lay outside of its ability. You could copy ears and use them as ears, or noses to use as noses, but two very different types of eyes with different supporting nerves clashed. The brain just could not support both at once as they stood, and so it would have to be something entirely new if you wanted both powers. They could as easily make up entirely new bloodlines as do that. And the month was not wasted, in that Naruto's clones, chiefly the ones who had gone to study law, as those had used very few techniques to start with, and thus had more energy and thus longevity, had seen to all of his business. But it did frighten the clan about how very dependent they were on him for everything, and most angels resolved to take up more of the slack on their own. Nobody was anxious to lose their collective husband, but they had to admit to the facts that they were ninja and those did die, even the best ones sometimes. So a support network for his wives and family had to be in place for in case he should ever be lost. Still, words could not express their joy in having him back after the reset. As an almost minor aside, from the Kitsune clan's point of view, the day of the third stage of the Chunin exam, right after Naruto had been disqualified but before the reset, the town had gotten invaded by Orochimaru again, this time using tactics that none of the girls had ever seen in person before. But Naruto had shown them the memories of this invasion style long ago, the one where Gaara was placed under a forced sleep illusion, releasing the one-tailed demon raccoon in the center of Konoha. Also, from different parts of the village lightning gathered together to form the six-tailed demon tiger, and various other elements combined to form the eight-tailed demon dragon. The destruction they wrought was completely unholy, and using that as a distraction, a cloud Chunin he'd later learn it was named Yujito had arrived to capture Hinata, although this time it was the lovely woman from Cloud who found herself surprised, having been totally unprepared for the girl's multilayered bloodlines, huge store of jutsu and radically new fighting style. Then she'd unleashed the two-tailed demon cat, and Hinata was completely outclassed, getting beaten and captured in short order while the rest of Konoha got reduced to a smoking, dusty depression not even fit to call a crater, having been blasted so many times it was more of a dip in the ground without even so much as a recognizable burn or impact shape. Using 17 taels worth of beasts to destroy a village was really quite excessive. There were 13 buildings in the Uchiha estate where one could access the library. Each one had redundant copies of the large and complex seal that created the extra-dimensional space that contained the library, scribed in ink on foundation stones that had then been weather-sealed with tar, so even on examination the seals were invisible, black ink under tar, and so long as even one of those remained, the library lurked in secret, waiting. All this time, and all unknowing, they had been conducting renovations so complete that he'd routinely been destroying each of those buildings and all 13 copies of that seal. Naturally, Naruto had been a bit leery about reactivating his shape-shifted Sharingan to find out the entrance code, but his angels pleaded enough that he did that despite his misgivings, granting access to that library at last. That was a big deal, because the Uchiha clan library was a big deal. The big disadvantage of the Sharingan as a hereditary clan technique was that it was not an automatic advantage. Each clan member had to activate their own, it did not come in a working condition. They were born only with the potential, not the reality, of the famous copy I, and only the actual threat of death could activate it. Hard and vigorous sparring would not bring it out. Training and effort were useless. The Sharingan activated only under conditions where there was a very real threat of death, and the trainee knew they were close to dying. So unless your training techniques were certifiably insane, they couldn't do it. Once it had initially activated, of course, the bearer could use it as he liked. But circumstances surrounding that initial switch from only the potential to now I have an active Sharingan had cost many of the Uchiha their lives. The Kyuubi attack had actually been one of the best things to ever happen to the Uchiha in that sense, as, in spite of their losses, which were relatively slight, the aura of sheer terror and violence exuded by the beast during its assault had left them with more active Sharingan-carrying members than at any other point during that clan's history. Of course, there were illusion setups that could stimulate fear and danger hormones enough to potentially activate a Sharingan. However, those were, by necessity, so intense that it was possible to die simply of the fear they caused and the strain they placed upon the body. Some said it was especially hard to learn it that way, as being an illusion made the situation worse, not better, for trying to bring out their bloodline. So mostly the Uchiha relied on actual deadly peril, as most ninja found enough of that on their missions. And, of course, that way they nicely avoided the difficulty of finding illusion specialists who cared enough about the Uchiha clan to activate their illusion-destroying bloodline, and yet were masters enough of their art to get those precise details just right to where the bloodline could activate with minimal risk to the patient. Usually, when a person spends a lot of time to become good at something, they are not too fond of whatever comes along to make that art useless. So it was rare to find any illusion specialists willing to help them at all, and the Uchiha themselves produced few, if any, illusion masters, as it was hard for them to devote themselves to a profession their bloodline, and many other such gifts, could defeat with ease. That just didn't match with their egos. So what experts they could find willing to help were less than true masters, lacking the detail and precision necessary to make activating a Sharingan's potential via illusions even approach safe. No, overall, the Uchiha had found that actual risk of death was lower out on real combat assignments than being probed by just as deadly illusions, in most cases, illusions generated by people who didn't like them very much. So, to make sure that as many of the young Uchiha survived those missions before their Sharingan activated as possible, the Uchiha clan made those who had activated it copy the techniques they used, or had stolen, into the clan library so that the younger generations could learn from those and be better prepared to survive those deadly circumstances intact. This had, over the generations, grown into a vast collection. Holding a mandatory library policy had also done the Uchiha clan some good in operating in spite of the Sharingan's second big disadvantage, in that stolen techniques arrived without organization or proper filing. Like throwing junk in an attic, the bloodline was just concerned with collecting the most massive amounts of information possible, and hang any stupid organization. This tended to make those with Sharingan careless, to say the least, about using their stolen skills to their best advantage. Heck, half of them couldn't even remember the names of all of the jutsu they already knew. And when it came time to use their skills, they had none of the mental triggers that say, hey, I have a solution to that problem. For Sharingan copied techniques that a person who'd learned them the real way would acquire. You might compare it to a man who has tons of bandsaws and other useful machinery in his basement, but never goes down there, never had to pay for any of it, and has no inventory of the place, so uses the screwdriver and handsaw that are hanging conveniently just inside the door of his garage. He knows those tools, so they are the ones he uses, even though he might have better or more efficient or powerful ones hidden down in the deep, dark unexplored recesses of his dusty basement. Uchiha had been known to die from circumstances they knew a technique that could fix, but had never thought to use. You might own an entire city, but if you had no idea what it contained or what it could do, and didn't think about it much, you wouldn't get much use from it. So it had done the Uchiha good to have a library forcing them to spend time contemplating their stolen techniques. Then at least they had visited those mental basements and at least seen what they had down there. It had done a lot of offsetting the tendency of not even knowing what they'd copied in any kind of useful sense, just piling up a stock of techniques in the backs of their skulls they never thought of again unless prompted by outside cues. Sitting them down and making them think about it for a while made them that much better at recalling what techniques they had available, brushing a few of the cobwebs off those unpaid-for tools. So, in a fight, they'd be more able to take them out and apply them without an enemy prompting them, say, by using that technique against them again. Even so, forcing them to sit down and catalog all they'd learned, transferring that knowledge into the clan library, had helped, but did not solve all of the problem. The copy wheel eye was infamous, in that those who used it had a marked tendency to use whatever techniques their opponent was using, whether they'd copied those in that fight, or 50 fights ago. But nevertheless it had granted the clan an impressive stock of techniques, perhaps the largest in all of the elemental countries, as virtually anything an Uchiha had ever copied, which was most anything they'd seen, had wound up in there. Of course, more than just techniques had been recorded in that place. The Uchiha clan had kept meticulous records of all of their activities, including some very secret and illegal ones. And the operational reports took up more space than the rest of the library. The Black Ops section alone was almost as large as the entire Jutsu section of their rather infamous library. After all, there are only so many techniques, but scheming can go on forever. Armed with the Uchiha clan head seal, stolen from the hollow space under the floorboards of Sajuke's apartment for this occasion, they were able to crack open the seals over that section and begin seeing what they had. And they got floored by what they read. Treason, thy name is Uchiha. Kin whistled as she held up the documents she had been checking over. Tenton's eyes were bulging as she read off in a different stack, shocked by completely different material. But it was Anko who summed it up best, you know. So much of what was screwy and made no sense about this town just got explained. The Uchiha were deliberately messing things up. They must have been putting puppet strings in place, preparing to take over control of Konoha, since the town was founded. Some of those strings got severed, some remain, but they'd been working at this for a very long time. Since the Kitsune couldn't even see each other over the towering stacks of Black Ops records, and it was possible to get lost among those files, that the Uchiha had been up to something for a long time was obviously the case. Tsune had turned over her own sheet of paper on the stack she'd been reading. And some of those tools they put in place to control this village are what Sarutabe's advisors found, and were using to do the same. This is where those loopholes and special emergency powers came from. The Uchiha have been putting them into place, law by law and line by line, from the beginning, planning their own eventual takeover. Hinata shook her head, staring at her own supply of pages. I don't know what you're reading, but what's before me has nothing to do with laws. These are all crimes of the blackest sort, all committed against citizens of Konoha. Then all heads turned as they heard Kyoinai shriek. Kyoinai stepped out of the forest into a clearing on the mountains, staring up at a sad and lonely mansion, towards the site of her greatest mistake. Naruto stepped out of the forest behind her, and gave her a solemn nod. The rest of Clan Kitsune also followed them out of the woods, girls carrying baskets containing blankets and picnic lunches for the celebration after they had succeeded in their mission, to finally undo one of the greatest schemes ever launched by the power-mad Uchiha clan. And Kyoinai personally wanted to make good her own greatest disgrace, a wrong she had been deceived into doing on her original student. Yakumo Kurama. Yakumo was a sweet girl and the heir of the Kurama clan, the last of their main family, but due to physical problems had never been enrolled in the ninja academy. Her natural illusion abilities, however, were incredible, the best her family had seen in generations. In some ways she was the antithesis of Rock Lee. But where he was, or had been, before they'd cured him, unable to use advanced chakra techniques, so compensated by concentrating solely on his physical powers, this girl had been frail and weak, with no constitution, so had hoped to become a ninja using her amazing illusion abilities. But no one had known all her physical problems had been caused by the Uchiha's poisons. They had assumed she was merely frail. Not that long ago, the Kurama were among the greatest advanced bloodline users of Konoha, just like the Uchiha had been. They used to be justly famous for their powers, the best Konoha had at illusions, and their influence had spread throughout the village in another example of how that country loved its bloodlines. But in the past couple of generations their clan had begun shrinking and their powers waning. Then the clan head and his wife were assassinated in a bloody fire, and afterwards the family fell apart so no one even saw them around town anymore. Unsurprisingly, their reasons for shrinking had been the same as the Senju clan. The Uchiha had been quietly killing them off in secret, hoping by this strategy to become the last and only remaining great clan. Then they would have Konoha all to themselves and rule it by default. The Uchiha's private records as discovered in their library had been very clear on this. For years they had been poisoning their rival clans, damaging their bloodlines, killing them off on missions where possible, all to reduce the power of their enemies by stopping rival clans from developing the skills of higher-level ninja. As there grew to be fewer and fewer Chunin and Jonin among them, the Uchiha's rivals naturally grew weaker, and the Uchiha comparatively stronger. There was a reason the Hyuga kept so many guards around their compound, not only for protecting themselves, but their food and water supplies as well. But for their own purposes, the Hyuga did not make this secret war known to the other great clans, so as they declined, the Hyuga rose, perhaps hoping in the end to reveal the Uchiha's treachery and have them destroyed after their plan had mostly succeeded, leaving only the Hyuga as a great clan. The Uchiha probably knew this was the Hyuga's intention, but were glad to let that confrontation wait until they were the last two great clans remaining. Then Yakumo was born with such unbelievably large power that the plans of the Uchiha to destroy the Kurama could have been put back a generation or more. Naturally immune to the bloodline-destroying poisons, the Uchiha had been forced to resort to other methods to destroy the girl. Too high profile to kill, the Uchiha weakened her body with different poisons, destroying her constitution and making her frail. But even this did not reduce the girl's desire to become a successful ninja. So on the night they killed her parents, the Uchiha secretly sealed a minor demon into Yakumo, blaming it on her bloodline and hoping it could gradually take control of the girl's mind, body and power until it could turn her gift against the village and the Uchiha could use the destruction she caused as an excuse to openly exterminate the Kurama clan for good, this time with official sanction. The plan worked better than expected. Yakumo's own clan blamed her for the deaths of her parents. She wanted to become a ninja more than anything, but her own clan feared her abilities as too powerful to control, mistaking the demon for the girl's own subconscious mind, and asked for the Hokage's permission to put her to death. Attempting to defer that harsh fate, the eager girl had been made Kuinai's apprentice months before teammate graduated. But then after training seemed unable to improve the girl's control over her abilities, the third Hokage had ordered her bloodline sealed. Since that time Yakumo had been living alone under guard in the otherwise abandoned Kurama Manor in the mountains above Konoha, learning to paint and quietly wasting away in darkness. 9 months of torment the sweet girl had done nothing to deserve. Senior ninja often had a major disgrace or two concealed somewhere in their past, and Kuinai's was that she could not discern the poisoning and forced possession for what they were, being led by the Kurama clan's assumptions to assume they were the girl's own failings instead of injuries inflicted on the child by jealous Uchiha, and participated in destroying Yakumo's dream. But that mistake would be undone tonight. Tsunade cracked her knuckles. They had the antidotes for the poisons the Uchiha had used. They'd very kindly left a list of all they'd employed. From that point collecting the right antidotes was trivial. Rebuilding her body to where it ought to have been without that damage would still be a challenge. But they could do it, although they'd have to keep doing it because of the resets. Still, that was a price they were more than willing to pay to reclaim Kuinai's honor. Spiking one more plan of the Uchiha's was just a bonus. Clan Kite soon approached the manor house in one body, firm expressions all around, and with Kuinai and Tsunade taking the lead. When the guards over the last main family Kurama came out to meet them, Kuinai showed them a stern expression, folding her arms across her chest, declaring, "New evidence has come to light concerning Yakumo Kurama, and her difficulties may not have anything to do with her bloodline at all. Tsunade of the Sunin is here to assess her medical condition and provide treatment." Stunned, the guards, 2 of which were medics, did nothing but stand aside. Naruto darted inside and raced ahead to find the main lounge of the manor up on the 2nd floor, creating dozens of clones to pull back all of the curtains in the darkened room, flooding the chamber with light to accompany his bright and cheery smile as he announced to the girl, "Yakumo." today you get to become a ninja. Stunned, and wincing at the light not seen for months, it was all the brown-haired beauty could do to gape in astonishment at the unfamiliar boy. Soon thereafter the chamber was flooded with kunoichi, a hospital bed produced, and to the bloodline heir's complete disbelief and astonishment, the seal placed on her bloodline abilities was the first thing they removed. Well, aside from all of her clothes, of course. They were doctors, and this was a checkup, preparatory to some intensive reconstructive work. Kuinai was already hugging her former protege, and explained, "I'm so sorry Yakumo. The Hokage ordered your bloodline sealed because of suspicions your own clan had that it was uncontrollable and dangerous to Konoha, but we only just uncovered evidence that it was never your fault at all. The Uchiha clan records have just been recovered, and they admit to secret operations against all other bloodline-carrying clans in Konoha. Your family were poisoned to reduce their gifts, and when those poisons didn't work on you they used other ones to destroy your body's health, and sealed a minor demon into you to make it seem like your gift was uncontrollable. I'm so sorry for not having noticed the truth way back when. I promise to make it up to you." Yakumo's response was utterly predictable. The sweet, shy and formally determined girl who had been hurting and miserable for months broke down into crying at once, hugging Kuinai back tightly. Naruto grinned and shot his red-eyed wife a thumbs up. Predictably, the demon inside the girl chose this moment to try and assert control and ruin everything, only to find itself face to face with the grinning maw of the Kyuubi no Kitsune. One massive struggle later and half of the manor house was wrecked, and the guards massively freaked out, but the minor demon was dead, while Yakumo was fine. The Kyuubi had only recovered nearly 3 taels worth of power from her near-death experience and coma of so long ago, and each tael seemed to be taking longer to recover than the last one. Still, what she had available had been totally sufficient for defeating one minor demon. "We're going to have to find an easier way of exorcising that thing," Shitsune mentioned conversationally as she righted a medical table that had been knocked over. The outcome of this one was never in doubt. Yugao brushed soot off her sleeves. One minor demon versus the Kyuubi. Come on. Still, it was a bit messy, Hinata allowed, gazing about the destruction. "I'll put someone on it," Hana declared. "Who knows? Researching better ways to end demon possession might have all sorts of utility. It seems easy enough to seal them into people, why should it be so hard to take them out? Don't you love me anymore?" The Kyuubi took the form of a small red-haired girl to plead with puppy dog eyes at the collected angels. They all broke down laughing in good-natured fun over the teasing. Yakumo's lovely brown eyes had grown to be as wide as saucers. "Is that, really?" She pointed a helpless finger to the fox demon. "The 9-tailed demon fox?" "Sure. That's her," Anko declared happily. "She's my pet. I call her Fluffy. Here, you can pet her." Naruto picked up the demon fox, who was now about the size and shape of a true fox, although with 9 lovely and luxurious tails, and plopped her down in the lap of their newest patient. Wonder swiftly overcoming terror, in no small part due to the overwhelming unreality of the entire situation, Yakumo slowly began to pet the Kyuubi. Ino began to smirk, inwardly deciding that they'd have that girl's bloodline in the clan sooner rather than later, and propagated among them not long after that, she felt certain. Kin's experiments to give them all the ice bloodline were finally coming to fruition, with more successes than not these days, and only a few more tries before they got it extended to everyone, if this followed the usual pattern. Anko's experiments to create a living flesh clone body were nearing success as well. The bodies she was creating were now increasingly viable. They could live on their own now, though their health and performance was flawed. Still, the hard work there had been done, and Haku and Zabuza were now close to joining them in a much more real and vital sense. If they didn't start work on the Kurama bloodline, they would have nothing to do on the medical front. And she knew how her clan hated boredom. Plus, Yakumo's bloodline was dead useful, and hit one of the Kitsune clan's few weaknesses. There were illusions that could defeat special bloodlines like the White Eyes, or even the mighty Sharingan, even at its highest levels. For most people those were all extremely high-level illusions. That they were beyond the reach of even most illusion specialists was perfectly understandable, as they were by definition cresting extremely potent defenses against them. However, even those special high-end illusions were limited. The special eye bloodlines were all vision-based, naturally, and the highly advanced illusions that could defeat those were not the same ones that could fool an Inuzuka's nose, nor had anyone ever thought up a way to deceive the Kitsune clan's new ears. A big part of that was that no one outside the clan or their allies even knew those ears existed. Still, it took an extremely complex and detailed illusion to fool even one of those greatly enhanced senses, and matching up 3 of them in one clan's bloodline set made them virtually undefeatable by illusion users. The vast majority of illusions fooled the senses, but the bloodline gift of the Kurama allowed them to fool the brain directly. So heightened senses were of no use against it, and there was no limit to the size of the illusions. By fooling the brain directly, it was possible to injure or even kill using illusions, to convince them their techniques don't work, or that they can't move. Virtually anything a person could perceive they could be made to feel was really happening to them. Previous to this, there was only one that could even try that route, Itakai Uchiha, using the kaleidoscope Sharingan's special time-forward/space illusion on which Naruto had based his own time dilation illusion he used for training. The Uchiha technique did not try to fool the senses, as most did. No, it was also one of those rare abilities that directly overpowered the mind. But, well, some of the higher-order Yamanaka clan techniques provided a potent defense against having their mind overthrown by an outsider. But the Kurama abilities provided another aspect to that. Ino, having long since convinced her parents that she was worthy of more and higher orders of her clan techniques, quite naturally knew of those defenses and had shared them with her husband and his wives. Since all present members of the Kitsune clan knew those Yamanaka jutsus, there really wasn't much point in trying to overcome them with illusions. On the plus side, the sensory details that made them so very hard to fool with illusion techniques gave them a massive edge in creating them. All hard detail for raw material one could want got included, as their senses were simply keener and processed more than the average person they were trying to deceive. And they had magnified that by training with each of their senses, trying to reach their maximum potentials. As the rest of the Kurama noticed a disturbance at the manor and attacked, afraid that the demon within Yakumo was getting loose, Naruto very quietly allowed the Kyuubi to go eat them while he kept the guards under illusions. Yeah, that might be more punishment than they deserved for the simple crime of having been deceived, but no one had required them to mistreat the girl or leave her alone for so long after she'd been sealed. As he ought to know better than any male alive, girls were social creatures, and it injured them to be alone for so long. Which was a big part of what he was intending to fix. Yakumo wasn't going to be alone again if he could help it. And, if the Kyuubi just happened to learn enough about the Kurama bloodline from devouring their branch house a few times to grant those abilities to himself and his wives without the medical work, so much the better. Clan Kitsune members were not just poised to be the medical and illusion masters of Konoha, or even the entire ninja world, they were becoming so. Then Naruto grabbed a hold of the startled, and still naked, Yakumo girl and swept her mind away while his clan medics went to work restoring her body. Naruto had been playing with that time dilation illusion of his again and had created a version for use on Gaara, much like the one he'd used on Lee. Only instead of cramming 2 years of chakra and elemental affinity training into 4 minutes of real time, he'd expanded the recording from its original 1 year in 2 minutes. As he felt more material ought to be covered, he used that time and taught basic hand-to-hand combat, as that was something that Gaara had never learned, had never felt the need for, honestly. To keep the two applications of the technique straight in everyone's mind, Kuinai had dubbed one the Elemental Master Illusion, and the other had come to be called the Martial Master Illusion, although even so that was something of a misnomer as the education gained was all mental, and thus only about the level of a top-rank rookie genin, not much of a combat powerhouse the name Martial Master usually evoked. Still, it was very like the physical knowledge of the rest of Clan Kitsune, in that obtaining the right reflexes, either by use of a captured Sharingan or practice out in the real non-looped world, could raise that up significantly, to about the level of a rookie Chunin, or, with further practice and instruction after the right reflexes had been obtained, to about mid-Chunin, where most of the rest of them had gotten stuck. The concept that he could create more of these than the original chakra training illusion more or less put the entire clan into an excited uproar, as they all wanted to know how to pass on more of the important skills this way. Conversations were ongoing among the clan about which one to create next, as the principle behind those two illusions seemed to be broadly applicable. The Elemental Master illusion set up to be used on Lee had proved able to be used to give instruction to just about anyone. They'd tried it out on a number of their fellow genin during the exam, and the recorded training program still seemed to work, although limited by the principles of its design. The illusion imparted only so much knowledge, and of a set type, so if you already knew some portion of that the recording just did that much less good for you. Naruto's angels didn't need it, not for themselves anyway, being already far better at those things than the mere illusions could teach. Still, the ability to pass on so much knowledge and experience to those who were not members of the Kitsune clan had fascinating potential. Naturally, none of them could create an illusion for training in a skill they didn't have, as it was essentially a very brief real-time attempt to teach a subject quickly, and you can't teach what you don't know yourself. Still, it was a very useful tool for bringing certain people up to speed. They'd used both illusions on Sakura, and the benefits had been measurable. Being trained in hand-to-hand combat and elemental manipulation had really changed the pink-haired girl's ninja fighting style for the better. So now the debate was going on over what to create an illusion for next. Tenten wanted him to create a throwing master illusion, as with interlocking fields of fire they could lay down some impressive coverage that would be able to shut down all but the most versatile of ninja opponents. In short, she'd like the others of her clan to be able to share the joy of her specialty. Yugao was the same for hers, wanting an illusion that taught melee weaponry so more of the clan would approach her level, more quickly. Also she gave the argument that they occasionally had to fight Hyuga, as that clan grew very displeased from time to time over the Kitsunes having effectively stolen the Hyuga heir from them just as she was getting interesting. Well, the Hyuga were only interested in power, and Hinata becoming powerful was a result of her Naruto-kun, so no one in Clan Kitsune felt the least need or desire to humor the arrogant Hyugas on this, even a little bit, and that occasionally led to fighting, and they couldn't always just blast the branch house out of existence via hand seals, that would be boring, and felt unfair to the poor, unfortunate branch members. One of the best ways to fight a Hyuga was with a sword or other weapon, as it had no chakra points to close, and the extra reach of a good, sharp blade was an excellent deterrent for keeping those bare-hand fighters far enough away so as to not be able to strike any hits on your body. Tsunade wanted a medical mastery illusion, as there were not nearly enough ninja medics in the world, and the ability to create more at need was a dream come true for her and Shitsune both. Actually, she was adamant that Hidden Sand needed the strongest burst of remedial medical training they could throw at it, as fast as it could be delivered, as their hospital and medical care was simply atrocious by her standards. The upper limit on what those specialty training illusions could teach you appeared to be set at about rookie Chunin level, but a Chunin level medic was still a far cry better than no medics at all, which is what most teams had. Hana actually spoke up with a different proposition than anyone, wanting an illusion covering what material ought to be covered in the Ninja Academy, basic stuff like academic knowledge, hand seals, chakra molding and the basic 3. The stuff any ninja ought to know, but a surprising number didn't. Her argument was based on 2 points. First was that most of the ninja who ought to know these things didn't, or didn't know them well enough, and they were taught for a reason, knowing history and geography, while they may seem boring subjects to kids who wanted to go pound on someone, provided surprising tactical advantages in the field. The history of ninja was war, and knowing what wars were fought before, and the ground they got fought over, gave a wealth of ideas to a ninja who knew what had gone before. So and so used a pass to pull off a trap and destroy superior forces. Well, you know there's a pass like that not far from here. Or 7 times in history people have tried X approach, and it never worked. It may seem rational, but it never works. Things like that. But Hana's second reason was actually far more compelling. It was that when the clan's children came into the world they'd be vulnerable to folks outside the clan, or even from outside the village, trying to manipulate or kidnap the vulnerable young tykes to learn the secrets of the Kitsune bloodline. Bloodline theft and the techniques thereof were concepts well known to the entirety of the Kitsune clan, and the possibility for others trying to steal their line was very real, as it was enormously valuable. Such a thing had even been attempted before, with Hinata, long before the resets even started. And that was only an attempt based on her precious Hyuga eyes. Now her bloodline was worth infinitely more. Actually, now the subject was broached, one of those they suspected would most like to chop Hinata up into tiny pieces to study her new bloodline powers was the Hyuga clan itself, and could explain some of those attempts on her by them. Not all of the Hyuga wanted her back because she was powerful and they'd like her to lead them. Some might want her because now she regularly displayed bloodline powers they'd like to have copies of for themselves. Hana's argument centered around the fact that the sooner the Kitsune could educate the children they eventually had in basic ninja skills and techniques, the less danger those children would be in from that sort of thing. And if, by the time they could walk, or whenever was deemed safe, they could have a basic ninja education shoved inside of their dear little heads, that could not only serve as a potentially deadly surprise to anyone trying to make off with them, but could serve as a foundation for the other training illusions they all wanted to develop. Also, it had to be said, the official Ninja Academy didn't do so hot a job on its own material. There were some, even among the Rookie 9, who had at best a tenuous grasp of some fairly large portions of that curriculum. Heck, there were Chunin, and not a few Jonin, who could use a refresher course. In the end agreement came that everything Naruto could teach via recorded training illusions was to the better. Fortunately for them, Gaara was actually a more or less blank slate for him to practice on, and one outside the resets so he was continually wiped clean, so Naruto could practice on him again and again. That enabled him to refine how he taught those ninja skills. The demon container for Shukaku only did one thing, use his sand. He'd not been officially trained in the ninja arts for very long. The guy knew how to use chakra, and that was essentially it. Everything else he did relied in some form on his sand. Sotomrai's youngest brother could be taught virtually anything over and over again until they'd gotten how to teach it down right. Hand-to-hand combat. Gaara didn't use any, not in any practical sense, it was all animated sand doing it for him. Elemental manipulation. He used his sand. That was it. So they were able to experiment with the two training illusions they already had on him, and the results they got were interesting, to say the least. For one thing, Gaara got far deadlier when he understood the basic principles of hand-to-hand fighting. Not that he moved around a great deal more, but he could anticipate the moves of his opponents better, and thus better use his sand to trap and block them. And once they'd started him on using wind techniques, adding long-range attacks and defenses to his repertoire, that just multiplied how scary he was. There wasn't anywhere safe on a battlefield, nowhere he couldn't reach you. But it wasn't only wind. That illusion taught basics in all 5 elements, and Gaara was just downright scary when he didn't have to devote all of his sand to everything he wanted to do, all of the time. When he could protect himself behind earth-style walls, less sand and chakra had to be used on defense. A lightning technique or two closed up one of the one-tailed container's few weaknesses, fast attacks at range. And the guy took a perverse delight in sending water jutsus back at his enemies instead of letting it soak his sand. But fire, he'd taken a brand new delight in burning things. It was disturbing. Tenten was of the opinion that once they could train him in throwing, Gaara would be able to form weapons out of that sand of his and project them like kunai or shuriken. Not so much on the face of it, until it dawned that once he could throw globs of his sand around he could get it closer to more people, faster, and thus become far deadlier. A knife stuck in you was one thing. But when that knife was able to groan and shift deeper into the wound all on its own, spreading out blades of itself to cut an ever larger hole. Scary. The general consensus was that she was right, but nobody wanted to try it just yet, as this newly improved and deadlier Gaara they already had was already taking some getting used to. He liked to play with fire a little too much. However, using those techniques on Yakumo, the big drawback to developing them was at least the first couple of times the one crafting the illusion had to stay inside to monitor it. It was only after patterns had strongly developed that they could record it to play automatically. So the big drawback was that it was boring. That explained why Naruto was positively delighted by the ability to dive into a fresh new mind he had not encountered before, to play with a friendly and nice person he'd never met before, those had been pretty rare during his life, and teach her all the material covered by those illusions straight through. He even stayed with her through the already mastered ones, the elemental training and hand-to-hand fighting ones, just to see her and get to know her, and, incidentally, in doing so improved those 2 illusions, refining them markedly beyond their original one-person audience. Of course, the natural result of 2 nice people, a boy and a girl, spending a great deal of subjective time together under friendly circumstances, had the natural result that when they came out they were very friendly. This was still Naruto, who routinely made friends out of his enemies. A nice and pretty girl like Yakumo never had a chance to dislike him, especially since she saw no reason to. He was helping her obtain a desire she'd long dreamed of. She was becoming a ninja. So, 40 minutes and 10 training illusions later, after 20 subjective years of being together non-stop, it was no surprise to the rest of Naruto's wives that immediately upon exiting the techniques Yakumo wrapped herself, still naked, around Naruto and began to kiss his lungs out. She then began to groan as Naruto began to massage her. Sakura stirred in jealousy as the Kyuubi nipped the girl minutes later, granting her their bloodline and welcoming her officially into the clan amidst great rejoicings to be had by all, with Kuinai at last feeling vindicated, able to forgive herself of her past mistake at last. Yakumo was a ninja, and had the best husband in all the world. One of the Sound Four turned to face his companion as they escorted Lord Orochimaru to Konoha. Teiya, you haven't sworn all morning. Censored. Even that didn't sound like you really meant it. Censored, yourself, you, censored. In truth, she had been cutting back on the swearing, even to dropping it entirely, because Naruto didn't like it, and when you did something he didn't like you didn't get the nifty goodies he could provide, like back and foot rubs. Realistically, she'd kill the rest of the Sound Four herself just to keep those massages coming. Heck, she'd defy Orochimaru to his face, or try to assassinate him, and either way die gladly, to keep Naruto happy with her. It was thoughts like that that caused her to wonder, sometimes if she hadn't just jumped from one cult to another when making the switch from loyalty to the Sound to adherence to the Kitsune. But she was so happy with the choice that she didn't much care either way. It was just curiosity. The daimyos in their courts did not live half so well as Naruto's wives. They ought to know from how many times a daimyo had tried to recruit the boy. So if wealth and privilege and near infinite pleasure made it a cult, so be it. She didn't know of a girl in the elemental countries that wouldn't join it if she got offered an opportunity. Just their bad luck she and her sister wives had gotten to him first. Teiya glanced at her fellow Sound Ninja across the campfire she'd prepared to cook breakfast over. Originally, they'd all just eaten ration bars they'd unsealed from scrolls. But that got old quickly. Even when a mission was just a few days' duration, it was a blessed relief to go off rations onto real food. In resets, where change was the only entertainment, good food was more vital to life than it was possible to imagine, because the recipe used was up to you to determine, and so could be as different as you liked. There had been one or two surprised eyebrows raised when she'd rolled out of bed and curtly ordered Kidomaru to use some of that golden spider thread of his to catch her a few dozen songbirds, Jirobo to make some mud domes to serve as ovens, Yukon and Sakan to go use that blood limit of theirs to jump in a creek, dissolve themselves, and use their cells to poison some fish to bring back to her so she could make them breakfast. Surprised, but they'd gone ahead and done it. Then she'd sent them all back out to gather fruits and nuts, while she herself had created a couple of shadow clones who were out carefully selecting herbs and mushrooms to flavor the feast. No one questioned where she got the bag of flour she was making crusts out of. Naruto had delivered it, but Teiya's arms were white up to her elbows as she prepared for the mince pies and other treats she was baking. Today was going to be a big day for Teiya. It deserved a celebration, so she was going all out as she prepared a feast. Meat pies of delicate songbird, hot sticky buns of wild honey and spices, roast fish and rice for the traditionalist among them, with fruit pies and nut cakes for dessert. Even Orochimaru had paused to watch her prepare this repast. The other Sound Four simply stared as they never knew she could cook before. Well, she couldn't, not before the resets anyway. She could understand her team wanting to carefully observe her to make sure she wasn't poisoning anything. Orochimaru didn't care. They still hadn't found a poison that would give him more than a slight headache. But he was finding her unexpected display of domestic ability amusing. Teiya was among the best actresses in Clan Kitsune. Because, like Naruto, she had the most demanding audience to play for. Everyone kept an eye on the Konoha demon container for fear he might go berserk. Sound Ninja kept an eye on each other, waiting for all too frequent betrayals. Only Kin had as demanding an audience to play before as Naruto and Teiya. But today she didn't care. She'd been campaigning for this moment for, well, since her first reset, really. The delays had been ghastly to have to wait through, even though she understood the reasons. It wasn't often a new bloodline got created under the nose of Orochimaru. Oh, it was possible. They could do it. But it wasted opportunities to just go ahead and do it when they could accomplish so much more with it. Orochimaru was a genius who had experimented with bloodline creation before. In fact, he'd made several near-successful attempts, just one of which was that potion cocktail that he'd given to Mitsuki to test on himself. It seemed a waste not to tap that genius for what they could get out of it. Teiya had woken up this morning without her memories as always, then as usual one of the stones she'd stepped on right as she was rolling out of her tent had been a shape-shifted Naruto clone who'd given her back all of her memories of these resets. For the longest time that had been the method used to restore her memories, and slip her a scroll of baking supplies. But today was going to be the big day, the day she got the Kitsune bloodline and would no longer have to be woken up at each new reset. Of course, it had only taken this long because, unlike the other girls in the clan, they had some rather special circumstances surrounding this induction ceremony. After all, you only become a Kitsune once, because once was forever. And it was a touch different to do it under the watchful eyes of the Snake Sanin. They'd just spent a rapid few one-day resets getting the introduction right. The girl tried not to mentally chant, this time for sure, as she prepared. Teiya was just tasting the food, having lifted the last of the pies out of the ovens, when her ears, her normal, ordinary human ears, not yet having foxy ones, although that was something she expected to change within minutes, perked up as she heard someone approaching the sound camp. Hiding was instant and instinctual for every sound ninja. Their camp vanished with all of the thoroughness only long-term missing ninja could achieve. This was natural, as most of them and their teachers had gone that route once, before being recruited to sound. Teiya was slightly annoyed at having to seal all of her freshly baked food into a scroll as she vanished also, but only slightly. This was part of the plan, after all. Orochimaru was one suspicious snake, and it took a lot to pull the wool over his eyes. To get his cooperation. Well, that was next to impossible. Luckily for them, Naruto was good at accomplishing the impossible. Moments later Tsunade and Shitsune rushed into the clearing, the younger holding a struggling boy dressed in orange all wrapped up in ninja wire. Quiet brat. Tsunade hissed, forming hand seals. Hidden up in the forest canopy, Teiya had to be impressed by the slug Sanin's acting. It wasn't often anymore she let herself go back to anything close to what she once was, but she was currently playing the drunken, washed-up gambler role to the hilt. This was the slug Sanin the rest of the world knew, the one before the resets, a former ninja hurting over deaths long gone by, and an image they had not seen nearly since they'd begun to include her, as Naruto's love had washed away those old hurts to the point where Tsunade forgotten them herself, despite often deliberate attempts to remind her around the village. Shitsune had placed Naruto on the ground, still tightly wrapped up in wire, as Tsunade set privacy seals around the clearing. Naruto, too, was portraying a brilliant job of acting like the dead last spies would have reported to Orochimaru the Uchiha's teammate-to-be, as he squirmed helplessly within those wires. The red-haired sound Kunoichi suppressed her laughter with the skill of long experience, as she knew he knew at least a dozen different ways to escape that cocoon of ninja wires binding him. I thought you said the knockout poison would last at least 12 hours. Shitsune protested, once again displaying a brilliant job of acting. It didn't even keep him down for 12 minutes. She ought to be doing a good job. They'd practiced this enough times, the last even being live dress rehearsals before Orochimaru. Hopefully this time they'd ironed out the last few errors and could go through to the planned conclusion. Teiya hoped and prayed this would be so. She'd waited enough. It's his regeneration, Tsunade declared, coming back from having set the privacy seals to look over the boy with a diagnostic jutsu. It cleared the poison long before he should have been able to recover. Will we still be able to? She'd soon cut herself off, lest she be heard. No, Tsunade shook her head, resigned. We'll have to do it here. Do what? Orochimaru asked, emerging from the shadows, ever the drama queen, Teiya and Jirobo flanking him, having followed his hidden orders. The other two members of the Sound Four were even now flanking the Kunoichi. Tsunade tensed, but her hand shot out to grab Shitsune's wrist and stop her from reacting with her Senbon launchers. The slug Sunin seemed to evaluate her old teammate for a moment, before she burst out, "Okay, I want to know how you learned about this." She challenged, rising up to crowd his pale face. "You've been having me followed, haven't you? Why have you come here? To interrupt? It's not like you haven't gotten away with worse." QQQQ. Orochimaru chuckled, genuinely amused over the mixture of anger, fear and somewhat disguised humiliation on the features of his old teammate. "I've done worse things than keep tabs on old friends," Tsunade he admitted. "And you ought to know why I've come here." Teiya kept her face blank and vaguely hostile only by dint of ceaseless experience. The snake Sunin was bluffing, implying that he knew what was going on and doing a masterful job of it. He couldn't know, because they'd only come up with this ruse during the resets. But still he portrayed himself as though in total control of the situation. The guy had to be among the most powerful ninja ever seen, as there was a lot more to power than just winning fights. He was most of the way there to changing the shape of the elemental countries in a way not seen since the first founding of the ninja villages. You didn't do stuff like that without a heck of a lot more than mere combat skill. Any ninja could learn stuff, but Orochimaru created new powers. Tsunade's shoulders slumped, as though defeated, and she actually sobbed. It was a marvelous performance. She looked broken as she dropped her head and wiped tears from her eyes. "I ought to have known." Shitsune stepped forward, putting her hands on her mentor's shoulders in concern, looking up at the other ninja in fright. QQQQ. The pale man laughed again, stepping forward himself. "Now, no need to be that way," he spoke soothingly to his old teammate. "We're here to help you." Once again Teiya successfully fought off the facial tic of her laughter. He was making all of this up. Still, it amazed her he sounded so genuine. His ability to manipulate people was nigh unto his combat skill. They only had to do better acting than he was, that's all. Tsunade raised her tear-streaked face to her old comrade, a spot of hope showing in her eyes. "You have?" she asked in the frightened wonder of a broken person who dares not yet hope. She let loose a bitter chuckle. "How silly of me. You've done this before. But we all hated you for it." She looked at him as though scanning his face for honesty. Orochimaru's display of genial, helpful friendliness was actually frightening considering how swiftly he'd turned coldly murderous over the slightest slip during their last few attempts at this. "Of course I am," he promised, laying a helpful hand on her shoulder. "Why don't you show me how far you've come so far? Then I can help you overcome the problems." A brilliant bluff. He knew nothing, so he'd just told her to lay out her plans for him to look over for errors. Tsunade acted just broken and desperate enough to go along with that. She drew in a deep shuddering breath. Well, you know about the fatal flaw of my regeneration technique. It's gotten bad. Oh. Orochimaru leaned close, already putting dozens of puzzle pieces together in his head. Now he suspected what she was doing. Looking for all the world as though she believed he already knew what she was implying, and that she was unaware that he was playing her for a fool, Tsunade simply dropped her permanent illusion as her answer. Actually, she hadn't needed that illusion for the longest time. Due to her adoption into the clan and the acquiring of their bloodline, she'd gone from merely looking young to being younger. She looked great, and was as healthy as it was possible to be. But that didn't fit the script, so for purposes of this little charade here, she'd put on a second permanent illusion under her first, one that made her look horribly bad. Before the resets, under her illusion, Tsunade had been a hag, aged by both natural means and her emergency regeneration technique to the point where she was so wrinkled she looked like she'd been sucking on lemons for 30 years straight, without break. Now, she looked worse. She was just as wrinkled, if not more so, only she also had ugly, cancerous warts covering her body. Her flesh sagged off her limbs like an empty bag, and was covered by ugly discolored patches. Her left cheek was inflated to the size of a grapefruit by a malignant tumor oozing pus, and oozing, open sores covered her neck, obviously infected. Her eyes were sunken and hollow, and her once gorgeous hair had partly fallen out. Orochimaru actually recoiled in shock. Poor Jirobo vomited, and Teiya could hear her other teammates losing what was left of last night's dinner in the bushes. Her own face turned green, and that was not a trick. Tsunade looked plainly awful. And she smelled worse, like old people and rotten drugs. It was a truly horrific illusion, and everyone was glad when she covered it up under her young look again. But one bonus of looking so bad was no one was anxious to probe closely to look for any flaws in her image, not that there were any. Tsunade was a medic, the best alive. She knew what awful ill health could look like, as she'd often enough been called to deal with those cases. So you see, she confessed. I've got to work fast. I haven't got much time left, as my body is falling apart. You've worked with immortality before. I was going to try to hack up this genin to study his healing ability. But she looked at him hopefully. Orochimaru now felt he knew what was going on, and his face grew one of his trademark two wide grins. To his understanding, his vain old teammate had run up against that barrier they'd all fought against, old age, and now was trying desperately to seek answers, just as he'd done so long ago. He could believe it, too. Her regeneration technique cost her years each time it was used. They weren't young, either, but that would age her older than most. Suddenly he felt in total command of the situation. You promised to help, she pleaded, while Shitsune just looked on, appearing both helpless and concerned. A slight variation to this script would result in Orochimaru whipping out his body transfer forward/possession technique to teach to his fellow Sannin, hauling Teiya forward to offer her as Tsunade's new host, then laughing as his old teammate got a new body, one already marked with his cursed seal, and thus forced to serve him much like the Hyuga branch house. Teiya hadn't liked that reset, but had gone along with it as they all knew it wasn't permanent, and knowing the guy's technique for taking over bodies went a long way to knowing how to reverse or defeat it. However, they'd learned that jutsu, so there was no reason to do that again. Actually, in every reset the first moment Teiya got a second, she'd remove her cursed seal and place an illusion over it so he'd think it was still on her. After a dozen such experiments, she'd gradually learned how to circumvent all the security that let him know whether it was actually there or not. The cursed seal illusion might not have general utility, but it was priceless knowledge in her position, as she woke up each reset practically within arm's reach of the Sannin, but didn't want to be his puppet any longer. Interrupting just before the pale snake was about to make the offer, Naruto rolled up against Shitsune's legs, toppling her over onto her surprised mentor, knocking both of them down on Orochimaru. Of such small changes are great things sometimes availed. Teiya leaped forward, already raising a kunai to stab the blonde genin she loved more than life itself, not a fact she was anxious to advertise to her current employer, but instead only managed to cut his coat and some wires as he wriggled about frantically. Wires cut, the genin sprang up and immediately reversed the entrapment technique, catching all of the pile of ninja and their sound 4 guards in a moment. The one time they'd pressed it, they'd proved to have only caught a mud clone of Orochi bastard. He was slippery as an eel, but he was playful in his own twisted way, and the guy was content to pretend they'd caught him. For now. Suddenly Naruto stopped, asking conversationally. Say, Orochimaru, you're interested in bloodlines, aren't you? Have you ever wondered what it does to a person to be bitten by the Kyuubi? It was a calculated risk, but everything with the snake Sannin was. The pale Sannin blinked from where he was bound. I would assume that it would involve total destruction of the body being bitten. Usually, yes, Naruto agreed. However, there are 1 or 2 circumstances under which it turns out different, like so. Bending over, he gave Tsunade a nip on her exposed shoulder, and in conjunction with that she released the shapeshift holding her clan package at bay, revealing herself with her delicious blonde foxy bits. Tsunade did a wonderful job of staring at her hands, releasing her permanent illusions, both of them, like it was one, and then rubbing at her face in wonder, only to discover an extra set of ears on top of her head. Her look of shock was priceless. Teiya had to remind herself it was fake. QQQQ. Orochimaru's limbs melted into his body and he slithered like a snake out of those wire bands, before reforming his human shape again, all of this done absently, like someone else would pick up a glass. Interesting. Isn't it though? Naruto agreed, all friendliness, before he quickly nipped Shitsune, who'd been staring in wonderfully faked shock at her mentor, and triggered all of the same changes to her. How does it work? The snake Sannin leaned over the boy's shoulder to inspect the changes, but for all he could tell they were real. That's because they were the real deal. They'd bear up under any amount of testing. But that was just to get him interested. He hadn't watched the actual conversion process from the stance of a medic or a scientist. They had deliberately slipped by these quickly to catch his attention with the process and get him interested in observing it further. By now Ino had already used one of the variants of her family techniques to launch an attack from extreme range and was now listening into the snake Sannin's thoughts. Heck, they had half the clan out there trying that. No control, but this way they wouldn't have to trick him into saying anything. What he thought when he observed this would be recorded by them as they silently listened into his private thoughts from the back of his head. Yeah, the Yamanaka could be insidious that way. They were one of the great clans for a reason, you know. Naruto grinned up at Orochimaru. Now that would be telling. He teased. Instantly he was wrapped up in summoned anacondas, against which Naruto kicked futilely, trying to escape their crushing hold. It's a contagion. I can pick females out as mates and the bloodline the Kyuubi gives me transfers a copy to them. QQQQ. Interesting, the snake Sannin gloated. Teiya found herself shoved forward, and found it the hardest experience of her life to pretend apprehension as this moment she'd been waiting so long for arrived. "Show me. I'd like a better look at the conversion." Naruto got released from the snakes and Teiya shot an apprehensive glance to the leader of her titular village, just to show the proper spirit of "Hey, what are you throwing me into here? Got to keep up appearances." Objections meant nothing to Orochimaru, of course. Kin had a complicated dance not to be used as a sacrifice for him bringing back the old Hokages. It was one of the more depressing lessons the former sound ninja had learned. Orochimaru had no loyalty to anyone but himself. You serve him, and he picks the way you serve him, even as experimental fodder. Often as experimental fodder, actually. Ninja skill provided no safety, as he wanted to test things on strong ninja as well as weak. They often complained that the man knew nothing of the value of a good tool. Naruto, of course, bless his kind heart, still didn't view ninjas as tools. It was one of those thoughts that every time it occurred to them turned his kunoichi into snuggle bunnies. "What does this bloodline of yours involve?" Orochimaru asked while Teiya nervously bared her neck. Naruto shrugged. "Oh, just the basics: stronger, faster, extra keen senses, a tail you can learn to use as an extra weapon, regeneration for injuries, and a form of immortality in that you no longer age after reaching your prime." He bit down on Teiya's neck. Only it wasn't Teiya. Naruto's eyes widened as his eyes met Orochimaru's, the blonde's teeth still locked in the Sannin's shoulder. He'd intended to tease his foe with a "see what cool stuff she's getting that you are not," and apparently succeeded only too well, as the Sannin had performed a flawless last-second body switch with the red-haired girl he'd actually intended to accept as a kitsune. Running through Orochimaru's mind at that moment was the thought of having a bloodline that did everything he'd ever wanted, sung the copy ability of the Sharingan, and being able to pass that through his own ninja with a few bites, and biting servants was already something he'd proven willing to do, as that was the way he passed on those cursed seals. However, Naruto neither liked nor trusted the Snake Sannin, and those were prerequisites to sharing his bloodline's power. The explosion of Kyuubi's power unleashed in fury eliminated everyone in that clearing, including a very stunned Naruto. That's it guys, hope you like the video. Like, share and subscribe the channel if you want more videos like this. Also tell me in the comment section down below if you have any recommendation about what I should make next. Thanks for watching.